You know, as Chris mentioned, we'd made an intentional decision not to carve out a special pile of resources. We're at the point, so we have mostly in our guerrilla tactics figured out where do people belong and how do we advocate those systems for them. I think having dedicated housing and housing models that fit for this group is still something that we're exploring in Seattle. One thing that we could use more of is a space that's a harm reduction space where people can be inside, housing first, go inside, and they may not be ready to completely stop using, but we know that when they get in the street and they get off the street and get a key to the door and suddenly have some safety and security, that's when they have the presence of mind to actually be able to really deal with their addiction and some of the fundamental issues that have been bothering them. So sometimes for us, it's figuring out some new housing models that will get them off the street quickly so that they can attend to other issues.
Thank you.
Senator Leno.
On that point, I'm very familiar with harm reduction, but if someone's in your program and housed and in drug treatment, but if there is a relapse, that does not necessarily disqualify them from continuing to work with you.
That's right. So people don't have to stop using to get our services at all. They can get arrested. We come meet with them. We do the psychosocial intake, and they don't have to. We want them to be honest about their use and their history, but they don't have to stop using at all. So if they get into recovery or treatment and then they relapse, we expect that that is actually a fairly typical process of recovery, and people do relapse, and then often they may come back into treatment later. So we don't ever give up on them. We continue that relationship.
Would you differentiate then between what you've just described and a wet house?
We do use wet houses, and some.
So that is a slightly different. So there's someone not interested in getting clean, but at least we want to get them off the street and housed and stabilized. So there may be the prospect of that.
We use both. So some people.
We don't know. Senator Mitchell and I don't know what a wet house is.
Sure. I'm happy to talk about that. We have actually one of the probably most researched examples of a wet housing in Seattle. It's a project called 1811 East Lake. And Seema Cliffoseffi, who's going to present next, she was actually the researcher who did all the research on that building. And it was designed for folks who they called chronic public inebriates, people who were drinking alcohol daily, regularly on the street, and to build a program where they could go inside and have a safe place inside regardless of their use. And they did a lot of research, SEMA did, actually, to look at what were the cost offsets, because a lot of these folks had been hitting the hospitals very hard. They were very, very expensive.
These are the frequent flyers.
Exactly. For us to manage in our community while they were homeless. And what they found was that they saved millions of dollars once they moved inside in terms of being able to manage their health care, manage their drinking. Many people, their drinking has reduced significantly. Some have become abstinents in that space. So the idea that people need to recover first before they move into housing, we found is just not correct. The evidence, research doesn't show that.
But I'm still not clear about what a wet house is. So it's a housing first model. Help me visualize.
Well, wet is just a term. It's just a term that people use for that. I would say that personally, in my home, people consume alcohol, so my house is a wet house.
Got it.
Okay.
So it's housing first.
I think we have these terms, right, that sometimes we expect that when people who have substance use disorders want to move into housing, we expect that the abstinence is going to come first. Right. But realistically, we know that actually people recover in their own way.
Okay. Assemblyman Quirk, followed by Senator Monty.
So what I'm learning here, particularly from you, is that this is not at all a traditional program in terms of how you treat the people. And I think one of the worst things you could do is say, we're going to have a lead program and then basically do the same things over and over again, except that you don't have to book the person. It has to be very different. And before anyone starts a program like this, they really have to know what works. And otherwise, it's not going to work. So thank you.
Thank you. Senator Monning.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for pulling this together with your staff and the other co-chairs. Thank you all for your work. Question for Ms. Gale. How do you fund yourselves? How many caseworkers do you have? And what's what's an average number of clients or people
Yeah.
that your caseworkers are working with at any given time?
So far, we've been fortunate to have foundation funding, and as Chris Neerut mentioned, we now are fully funded under state and county funds. We also, with the Affordable Care Act coming in and all the revisions that have happened, our county is changing how Medicaid is administered. So as of April 1st, we will also be able to use Medicaid dollars to help fund the work that we're doing. They've changed the definitions of behavioral health care so that it fits more of a case management model, which is what we do for substance use disorders, which really lets us reach people in kind of a pre-recovery process. So we're going to be able to use Medicaid dollars for that. And we have felt that the people that we see in lead need a fair amount of intensive care, and because we really want an individualized, outreach-based model, our caseload has been about 25 to 1. If we go higher than that, which we have occasionally had to go up to 30, 35, our staff are just putting out fires, and they're in their office, and they don't really have the chance to go on the street in the way that we feel like we need. I think another piece of it, and we've talked about this a little bit, but one of the things I did want to mention is just how critical the relationship between not just the provider and the client, but between the case managers and the police officers and the lawyers, how critical it is that we have our relationship really established. And our staff also have to be responsive to police officers who are in a crisis, emergent situation often, so we have to be ready and available.
How many case workers do you have?
We right now have about 10. We have 330 in our system, but we've just gotten additional funding, so we'll be adding more. And as mentioned, we're going to some other jurisdictions around Seattle. So.
And this, you just raised in the last part of your answer, crisis intervention, law enforcement, working with that, with mentally disturbed. Do your caseworkers ever end up working with law enforcement in crisis situations?
We're available to them. We do not have the staffing capacity now to do 24-hour service. I'm not opposed to that model. We just haven't had that ability. So we're really trying to work the hours that we can get our clients into services. So when businesses are open, when housing is available, and be responsive to the police officers. So we have had evening shifts and early morning shifts so we can do third watch, second watch. But for the most part, we are an 8 to 5 program, and then we rely, in the middle of the night, we rely on 911 crisis systems.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then final question, when you describe wet house, does that include continued illegal drug use, or just alcohol?
So I'm not sure wet house has an exact definition, so it could be used in both. I think it's typically used as alcohol, but there's also the possibility of people, we know that there are housing first models in Seattle that people continue to use. For instance, there's another project that's particularly developed for people with HIV and AIDS, and often those people may be still using drugs, and as long as their behavior is within the privacy of their own room, they're allowed to maintain their unit, and that behavior is not causing a public nuisance. It's not causing a problem in the building. People who, they have the right to privacy and have their own room in the building. So that's a building that does have drug use in the building.
And just a final comment, and you can respond if you want. It does sound like a model that, if not described as decriminalization, the fact that you're not necessarily filing a criminal charge, is it referred to as decriminalization, or is that another level?
So I think within the LEAD program, even our model, there are differing opinions about, thank you. There are differing opinions about continued use. I know the prosecutor's office is not of the mindset that we are condoning continued use. I think what happens is we're looking at those new cases that might come after their LEAD referral in terms of have they made any sort of progression in terms of our traditional model of accessing housing and then getting treatment and getting stable. So it doesn't necessarily mean that just because they're referred to LEAD, we are not filing new cases. We're just looking at the individual, where they've come from. Are they making any sort of progress that would warrant us in not filing that case, coming up with a different resolution?
I was the police captain in the downtown area when 1811, the wet housing for the chronic public inebriates were started. and then was fortunate enough to be a team member of the LEAD initiation. Both times, it was the downtown businesses and condominium owners, which predominantly are conservative. They don't believe in paying for housing where people get to use drugs, because that's just anti-American. However, the results when we created that housing was, and Chloe was very polite, but these guys, and some women, but it's mostly guys, were defecating in doorways, urinating in doorways, sleeping in doorways, using in the restrooms, using in the alleyways. Once 1811 was created, the use still went on, but it was reduced. But the police started getting less complaints. Public housing, or the private business owners, the Downtown Seattle Business Association, the people who own the buildings, they said, okay, I don't believe in paying someone, but the return on my investment is better, and my customers are happier. So I'm all for it. And that's what allowed LEAD to get a little bit of traction at the beginning, because they had experienced the issue with chronic public inebriates, and downtown was cleaner.
Thank you. Thank you all very much, and I hope you'll still be here if there are more questions afterwards. But we are going to move on to the evaluation, both in terms of participant outcomes, recidivism reduction, and I think what we're all interested, because where California has been most challenged, is how to get the savings necessary to invest in the long-term solutions on many levels. So money saved is important to us. Thank you.
Well,
Welcome.
thank you, Madam Chair and the members of the committee. In true academic fashion, I've prepared a PowerPoint presentation, and since I am the last speaker, hopefully I'll be able to sort of highlight the points that my colleagues have spoken about, and I'll try not to be too repetitive. So my name is Seema Cliff-Asefi. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Washington and Harborview Medical Center. And I'm presenting here on behalf of my colleagues, Dr. Susan Collins and our research scientist, Heather Lonzak. Together, Dr. Collins and I co-direct the Harm Reduction Research and Treatment Center at the University of Washington Harborview Medical Center. And at the Heart Center, we work collaboratively with substance users, community members, and organizations to develop harm reduction-oriented interventions that help to reduce substance-related harm and improve quality of life for affected individuals and their communities. And Dr. Collins and I are the principal investigators on the LEAD evaluation. So just to get started, I'll provide just a very brief background on how LEAD came about, although you've already heard from my colleagues this morning. I'll tell you a little bit about the LEAD program and introduce the evaluation design, and then talk about our findings to date. So as we have been talking about this morning, we know that despite best policing efforts, drug users and sex workers are frequently cycling through our criminal justice system in what we refer to as a revolving door. And we also know, as we've heard this morning, that the traditional approach of incarceration and prosecution has not helped to deter this recidivism. So on the contrary, this approach may actually be contributing to limiting opportunities for folks to enter the workforce or obtain housing, which relegates repeat offenders to continuing to work in illegal markets. This traditional approach has also created obstacles to obtaining housing, benefits, and employment. And so thus we know that there have been calls to engage these individuals so that they may exit the revolving door. And we know that LEAD has responded to this call. So as Chris talked about this morning, LEAD is a pre-booking diversion program that offers low-level drug offenders and sex workers who come into contact with the criminal justice system, harm reduction-oriented case management and legal services as an alternative to incarceration and prosecution. And as Chris alluded to, LEAD is a collaborative partnership just demonstrated by the team who is here today. So it is a unique partnership between a diverse set of stakeholders. And really, as we've been hearing, the primary aims of LEAD are to reduce harm and improve quality of life for both affected individuals and their communities. And because LEAD was the first known pre-diversion booking of its kind, an evaluation was critically needed to inform key stakeholders, policymakers, and other interested parties of its impacts. In other words, people wanted to know, does it work? So Dr. Collins and I were approached by the LEAD Policy Coordinating Group to help answer these questions and conduct an independent evaluation of LEAD's effects on key criminal justice outcomes. Subsequently, we applied for and received funding from the Laura and John Arnold Foundation to conduct this program evaluation. And just to give you a sense of the primary aims of LEAD, so I just want to kind of walk you through our specific aims. We do have 4 for the purposes of today's evaluation. I will be presenting on the first 2. Although I am excited to say that we are currently working on finalizing specific aim 3 and hope to have those results finalized by the end of this month, early April. So I'm happy to share those when they become available. So specific aim 1 was really looking at jail bookings, jail days per unit, public defense costs, and costs associated with filing. So, I'm sorry. So for specific aim 1, we were really looking at the impact of LEAD on criminal recidivism, as we talked about. And for specific aim 2, we were looking at LEAD's impact on cost and system utilization, and also just to give you an idea of the cost breakdown of LEAD. So just to give you a sense of our evaluations to date and share with you the design that we used what we call a non-randomized control design to analyze the impact of the LEAD program on various outcomes of interest. And just to let you know that randomized control trials are really the gold standard, but because often we have real-world implications where it might not be viable to randomly select the participants, we did settle on a non-randomized control trial. And this kind of evaluation design involves assigning participants to either the LEAD program or the systems as usual. That is jail booking and prosecution as they typically would experience. So people who receive the so-called system as usual made up what we call the control group. And people who were assigned to the LEAD during what we called a green light shift were what we call the LEAD group. So just to walk you through this, individuals who are suspected of low-level drug or prostitution offenses, either through social contacts, as we heard earlier, or arrest, during a officer's green light shift. So the shifts were randomized where officers were either on a green light shift, which means if they came into contact with someone who qualified for the program, they were able to divert them, or a red light shift in which the same people might come into contact with police officers during a red light shift. They would be assigned to the control group and system as usual. And just to give you a sense of our evaluation time point, we had to make a defined time point. So the day when people are assigned to LEAD or the control group is known as their special day. So that's the day that they were diverted to the program. And this special day marks entry into the evaluation as either the LEAD or the control participants. And any time prior to this special day is considered the pre-entry period. and any time after that is considered the post-entry period. So I will be referring to pre and post-entry periods so that you can keep that in mind. And what we did is we captured 2 years prior to the lead special day up to July 31st, 2014. So just to give you an idea of our sample, we followed 316 people overall, 202 people who received lead, and we compared these people with 114 individuals who were in the control group. Participants were referred to lead between October 2011 and January 31st, 2014 for the purposes of this evaluation. And just to let you know that the sample was predominantly male, so we had only 34% female. And as Chloe was referring to earlier, 80% of this sample were homeless individuals. And as you can see from the racial and ethnic breakdown, 60% of our participants were African American, followed by 26% European American, and the remaining breakdown. So we do have a disproportionate representation of African American men.
And what's your African American population in Seattle?
Roughly, yeah, 8.5%. So there is a and these numbers reflect what we see in our criminal justice system.
Yes, they do.
So
All over the land.
all over. And the mean age of the sample that we looked at was roughly 40 years old. So let me first talk about the recidivism findings, which were reported in our specific AIM 1 report. So we looked at people's recidivism trajectories both over the shorter term, which was 6 months pre and post-entry, as well as over the longer term, which included the entire evaluation period from 2 years prior to the start date of their special day all the way through July 31st, 2014. So in the short term 6-month analysis, we found that people receiving lead were 60% less likely to be arrested than people in the control group during the post-evaluation period. This finding held up over the longer term. Over the entire course of the evaluation, people in lead were 58% less likely than people in the control group to be arrested post-entry. And in the lead group, this represented a 30% reduction in the proportion of people arrested compared to a 4% increase in proportion of people arrested in the control group. Additionally, we found statistically significant reductions in the proportion of lead participants who were charged with a felony compared to control participants, which translates to 39% lower odds. And so as the primary aim of LEAD was really to slow down the street to jail to street cycle, these initial findings provided some compelling evidence. And the next step of analyses was really to look at the impact of LEAD on system utilization and associated costs. And for these next set of analyses, we calculated average yearly criminal justice and legal system utilization. And this included things like the average yearly number of bookings in the King County Jail, days spent in the King County Jail, and the Washington State Prison System, as well as felony and misdemeanor charges. And when we calculated the lead and control groups change in their system utilization from the pre to the post-entry period, we calculated their change from the pre to the post. And across nearly all outcomes, we observed statistically significant pre to post-entry reductions for the lead group compared to the criminal justice system. So specifically in this graph here, compared to the control group, lead program participants were booked into jail 1.4 fewer times. Compared to the control group, lead participants spent 39 fewer days in jail. Again, lead participants had 87% lower odds of at least one prison incarceration, and they had a significant reduction in felony cases. So we next looked at the average cost per year. I know people have been talking about costs of lead associated with the criminal justice and legal system utilization. So the costs that we looked at specifically for these analyses were related to jail bookings, incarceration days, prosecution and public defense costs associated with felony and misdemeanor cases. And when we consider changes in yearly average costs from the pre to the post entry period, we found that lead participants showed statistically significant and substantial cost decreases. So in fact, on average, each lead participant costs the system $2,100 per year. In contrast, each control participant costs the system $5,961 more per year.
So those costs, the additional 2,000, are all of the other services that we've heard about?
That's correct.
Does it include
Prosecution, it does not include housing.
Okay.
So for the purposes of, and I think that when doing cost analyses, it's very, very complicated. And I personally am not an economist. And in order to really do a true cost savings analyses, you have to take into account everything else that is happening. And I think, as Natalie pointed out, it's very, very difficult to do that. But what we could do was show the actual costs of following a person through lead, through the criminal justice system, through the prosecution and the defense costs.
But that 11,000 includes housing, as in jail.
That's correct. that is a correct read. Yes. A form of housing that we'd like to,
We can find a cheaper way.
That's right. So just in sharing these data, I was able to show how, in addition to reducing recidivism outcomes, lead translated into cost savings for the Seattle community. The next question we wanted to address is, and what people are interested in, is how much did it actually cost to implement the Seattle LEAD program? So I know for a lot of different communities who are considering starting up, they want to know, like, is this feasible? How can we do this? And what do we need to make this happen? So the first thing that I want to direct your attention to is the total cost of the LEAD program over the nearly 2.5 years of the evaluation period. And this cost during this evaluation timeframe was roughly $2.28 million. Or if you translate that into a yearly cost, it breaks down to an average of $1 million per year, or more specifically, $947,000 per year. And when we look at how these costs are broken down, they fall into 3 primary categories. So we have personnel costs, which include salary and benefits of individuals associated with conducting the LEAD. So for example, as Chloe was talking about, REACH case managers, program managers, other REACH staff that are associated with the project, as well as personnel from the prosecuting attorney and the public defense attorney offices dedicated to the LEAD startup and project management. So as you can see here, roughly it's a kind of a third split where 31% of the breakdown goes towards REACH personnel. Roughly 28% has gone towards public defense and prosecution costs in terms of program startup. And 31% has gone to client assistance. How is that defined? So client assistance, I will define that in just a moment in the next slide. So, client assistance are really things like housing, education and training, transportation, clothes, food, anything really that the client needed to help provide them with support and stabilization. So that's sort of what Chloe was talking about with the unique case management and tailoring the individual program. Everybody has slightly different needs. And so these costs, the flexibility in costs are really important. And as you can see here, one of the largest costs went towards motel or interim housing, so roughly 56%. As mentioned earlier, roughly 80% of the population that we're talking about in the Seattle community are in fact or were homeless. Therefore, it's not surprising that we see a bulk of the funds expenses going directly towards this category. And depending on the particular community, this number might look different. And so then what we did is we asked, what does it cost to actually keep a person in LEAD? So over the first 2.5 years of the program, the cost of LEAD averaged roughly $899 per person per month. However, I really want to put a caveat in here that it's important to note that these costs included program startup. And after the first 4 months, so this was the first program in the nation, and so there were, upfront costs. However, we see that after the first 4 months, the costs decrease exponentially and plateau to the start of year 2, such that in the final month of the evaluation period, the average monthly cost per person was $532. And we only expect that cost to go down as the program becomes more established, and maybe we can speak to that afterwards as well. So before concluding, I thought it was important to mention again some caveats for you to consider when you're translating these numbers into your communities. As I alluded to earlier, there's specific features of the Seattle experience that may not generalize to other communities. For example, there's certain participant characteristics such as the sociodemographics that contributed to costs being allocated in the way they were. And the same is true for more general community characteristics. So the cost of living in Seattle is really relatively very high. Also, the LEAD implementation was started before the Affordable Care Act rollout in Washington State. So in some communities where the ACA is currently available, programming costs may not be as high as those featured in these specific set of findings. This is a point-in-time count. By the same token, in communities where the ACA has not been enacted, LEAD programming may be more expensive because those communities would bear more of the program costs. So taken together, the costs of implementing LEAD programming in this report are very representative of the Seattle community. So we do find that important to share. So in closing, I just want to say that LEAD precipitates reductions in criminal justice and legal system utilization and associated costs. LEAD costs decrease steadily after initial program startup costs. So in other words, for communities wishing to implement this program, you can expect that on the front end, there'll be top-heavy costs associated with starting up such a program, but that these costs do, in fact, stabilize over time. And so we argue that the LEAD does provide a penny-wise alternative to the current criminal justice system as usual. And these findings are particularly meaningful when we place them in the context of existing interventions targeting recidivism in King County, Washington, and across the nation. Specifically, LEAD showed more favorable recidivism outcomes compared to the system as usual, which includes various therapeutic drug courts. Additionally, LEAD participants showed meaningful and statistically significant reductions in criminal justice and legal system utilization and associated costs. And given the challenges of conducting such an evaluation under these real-world conditions, we were actually very surprised at the robustness of these effects across the various important outcomes. So we would argue that this evaluation does, in fact, provide compelling support for the LEAD and as a viable alternative to existing criminal justice system approaches. So thank you very much, and here's a host of people that have helped throughout the evaluation.
Yep, thank you so much. I do have a question.